Greetings. I'm Michelle English, and on behalf of the MIT Center for International Studies, would like to welcome you to today's Starr Forum. We're honored to have with us today Una Hajdari to discuss NATO, the Balkans, and Ukraine, the geopolitical implications of the European periphery. Ms. Hajdari is a freelance journalist from Kosovo and is at CIS as the 2018 Elizabeth Neuffer Fellow. This fellowship is sponsored by the International Women's Media Foundation and provides a unique opportunity to female journalists working on human rights and justice issues, allowing them time away from the field to do research at MIT and to report at the Boston Globe and the New York Times. In our typical fashion, today's talk will begin with our speaker, followed by a conversation between our featured speaker and our discussant. Followed by that, there will be Q&A with the audience. For those asking questions, I'd like to remind you to line up behind the mics and to please just ask one question at this time, just so everyone can get their questions in. And also, because this talk is offered as an IAP for MIT students, I just wanted to take a quick count of first all of the MIT graduate students who are attending today. If you could raise your hand. Any MIT grad students? Okay, 2, 4. And if you are a MIT undergraduate, raise your hand. Okay, thank you. Now I'd like to introduce our discussant. Elizabeth Wood is professor of history at MIT and the author of 3 books: Roots of Russia's War in Ukraine, Performing Justice, Agitation Trials in Early Soviet Union, and The Baba and the Comrade, Gender and Politics in Revolutionary Russia. Okay. She's also written numerous scholarly articles on gender and performance, as well as blogs and other publications about Russian history and current events. Within MIT, Professor Wood serves as co-director of the MISTI Russia program, coordinator of Russian and advisor to the Russian language program, and she also holds a secondary appointment in MIT's Global Studies and Language section. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wood.
Greetings. It's great to have everybody here. I'm going to be very brief. I just want to set the stage for what we're about to do. First, let me say thanks to Michelle English and Laura Kerwin, who do an amazing job with these Starr Forums. They're really, really extraordinary. I also want to make 2 quick announcements to say that the MIT Russia program, in conjunction with the Center for International Studies, is going to be bringing 2 Russia-related speakers this spring. One is Brian Taylor, who will be here on February 26th, speaking on Putinism, his new book. And the second is former Ambassador Michael McFaul, who will be here on March 14th, also in a Starr Forum. So if you're on the Starr Forum mailing list, you'll find out about those, both those, certainly the Michael McFaul event. If you want to find out more about our MIT Russia events, Katya Zabrovsky is our managing director, and she's over here in blue and red, the Russian colors, and we have a sign-up sheet out in the lobby. So please feel free to join our mailing list. And if you want to be on the CIS Starr Forum mailing list, talk to Michelle and Laura. So obviously, this is a key moment to talk about NATO, the Balkans, and Ukraine, as you've all probably been thinking, which is why you're here. President Donald Trump has just said that he's not sure the US should be part of NATO. And Russian President Vladimir Putin has just yet again lambasted NATO as he's about to travel to Belgrade. So what's interesting is to see why NATO is becoming the hotspot, why there's so much insecurity and uncertainty right now as to the size of NATO, what's going to happen with NATO, and especially what's going to happen to NATO in the Balkans. One of the things that Una Hajdari and I are very interested in is how did the conflict get going in 1999? What's been happening since then? I'll say a few more words about Una Hajdari. We're extraordinarily lucky to have her here this year, thanks to the committee that brought her for the Elizabeth Neuffer Fellow. She has published extraordinarily widely for someone who is still, I'll say this, fairly young. She got her start in Kosovo, which is where she's from. So she's from the Balkans. She's fluent in many languages, at least 4. She has she got started in the Balkans where she wrote for Balkan Insight. She was the managing editor of a journal called Kosovo 2.0. She has contributed to Agence France Presse. She has contributed to German newspapers, Die Tagezeitung and Berliner Morgenpost. She's published widely in the US press in Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, The New Republic, The Nation, The Guardian, and of course, most recently, the Boston Globe, where she's been interning this fall. And what I think is extraordinary is that she publishes on all sides of the spectrum, both the more conservative American papers and or news outlets and the more progressive, exactly. Anyway, she's also won awards for her journalism. One award was for a study on the education of minority groups, and another was on war criminals who've maintained a hold on power in post-war Kosovo. So, and at the end of this month, January 28th, she'll be leaving us to go to the New York Times, where she'll be interning at the international desk. So I'm going to turn it over to Una, and she can talk about the Balkans. We have a couple slides if you want to use them.
Yes. Hello. Just a quick check. Do I speak to my mic okay? Whatever I'm looking at. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your interest in this topic. I feel that NATO is only the subject of scandalous and sensationalist headlines, and that not very often people not interested in getting into the meat of the issue and the reasons why NATO expansion is such a big and important topic in Eastern and Southeast Europe. The fact that it's being mentioned more than ever by the current U.S. president is something that is brought it sort of to the foreground of political debate on a global level. But most people don't understand why the post-socialist East European and Southeast European societies have been focusing on NATO so much over the years. So just briefly to go back to the history of NATO, for those who might not know very much about it, in 1948-49, when after World War II and the defeat of Nazism in Europe, the Soviet Union the European security situation is divided between the spheres of influence of the Soviet Union, the spheres of influence of the Western powers, divided along the lines of where they advanced during World War II and where the world ended. For Western European countries that had definitely collaborated amongst each other, but also with the United States, it was important in World War I and World War II, it was important to sort of solidify this relationship and to make sure that they could rely on one another in case they were threatened by Germany. This is before West Germany joined NATO, and in case they were threatened by the Soviet Union. And this is an important element in this because NATO is in many ways formed to prevent a possible Soviet threat. And this is something that defines the role of NATO later on in history, up until this day with the successor state of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation. And so NATO doesn't do very much initially. With the Korean War in 1950, which is in many ways a proxy war, but then develops in a full first and only confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States, the signatories of what was initially just the North Atlantic Treaty form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They assign a Supreme Allied Commander for Europe and decide to sort of make this military alliance a formal thing and something that dictates their foreign policy. And for most of the Cold War, NATO acts in different ways. It's more active. Sometimes they act more as a unified front, sometimes more individually. This is shown through the example of, let's say, France and other countries that end up developing their nuclear arsenal independently as independent countries, just in case they have to fend off for themselves and not as part of the total military alliance. But all of this changes in 89 or 90 with the fall of the Soviet Union and the breakup of, and of course we need to mention that in retaliation to the formation of NATO, the Soviet Union forms the Warsaw Pact or signs the Warsaw Pact, where it and its satellite states sort of decide to organize for their common defense, mainly spearhead. It's much less a society of equals, which NATO was considered to be, but definitely organized the security situation in Eastern Europe along the division line through Germany and what is referred to as the Iron Curtain. This changes in '89, and with the fall of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union, it sets its satellite states free. They're independent countries; they can do their own thing, militarily and otherwise. And so NATO does some intense soul searching at this point. What does it do? Is an alliance that was formed to ward off this other big power? Is it still necessary? And also, this comes at a time of big, sort of massive euphoria in Europe and in the world. The liberalism is spreading. We don't need wars. We're not going to have wars. Nuclear arsenals are toned down. Demilitarization happens in many parts of the world. And at the same time, in Europe specifically, this new political alliance is formed, which existed as an economic one for a long time, and then got transitioned into a form of political alliance officially with the Maastricht Treaty in the '90s. But which sort of forms this new community of nations in Europe, political community, where all of these post-socialist states were going to become, or these post-socialist states were going to become a part of. Now, as all this is happening, and then of course, mercifully, the Soviet Union falls apart peacefully, or breaks apart peacefully, and there's no escalations in that aspect. Of course, one doesn't think about Chechnya and other things, but that's a topic for Russia experts, not me. And so, but with all this like happy euphoria in Europe, there's one part of it, the southeastern region of the Western Balkans, that doesn't seem to want to transition, or doesn't seem to transition peacefully into this new liberal European global order. Yugoslavia was less sort of a big worry for the Western powers because having famously split from Moscow, or split from Stalin, but then maintained its own sort of form of socialism after '48, it it received U.S. aid for the Marshall Plan, but also formed the non-aligned movement, which incorporated other socialist countries and post-colonial countries and states through different parts of the world, like India and Syria and Egypt and stuff like that. But anyway, it wasn't a big problem for the West because there were lines of communication that were open, and it was actually even considered to be a place where a lot of people who wanted to be involved in Russian issues from the West would meet, or the Yugoslavs were good intermediaries because they were socialists, so the Soviets were okay to sort of collaborating with them. And that changed a lot, but again, different topic. And the West, but they also had lines of communication open with the West, and were sort of a meeting point of East and West, which is very symbolic considering what happened in the '90s. So Yugoslavia descends into, first of all, crazy nationalist sort of, I don't know what to call it, crazy nationalism. Intense nationalist sort of sentiments erupt in Yugoslavia, mainly because most of it was a federation of socialist states, which was made up of republics that had different ethnic groups as the dominant one in each separate republic, and every single one of these republics wanted to be independent and felt like now that the federation was falling apart, they could deal with all their grievances that they hadn't dealt with during the time of the Socialist Federation, during World War II, before World War II, as happened in other places in the world. And so it started with the northernmost republic leaving Yugoslavia. That's Slovenia. That's where Melania is from. For people who might want a reference point. Oh, now would be a good time for maps. Since I've gotten to that point. So that's not, yeah, so Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece, and Albania are obviously not part of Yugoslavia, but it's from Slovenia to Macedonia. So Slovenia is the first republic. There's a pointer here, I don't know how to use it. Slovenia leaves first, and then, we then see the Romanian republics sort of clash with each other, first politically, and then on an individual level between groups, and that escalates into war. And with the war properly starting with various interventions by the Yugoslav army and in Croatia as it was preparing to secede. Now this was a tricky question because many believe that Yugoslavia should survive as a federation. It did have pluralist elections in some parts of it, even when it was a federation. And its survival, the plan was to have Yugoslavia survive as a federation and be incorporated into the EU as a whole. And but since some of the republics wanted to leave, wanted to do their own thing, not be part of Yugoslavia, especially because at this point it was led, the head of the Serbian branch of the Yugoslav Communist League was Slobodan Milosevic, who many of you might not know very much about, but was a Serbian strongman who definitely believed that Serbia, that bigger country there, and with the lower part that's partitioned, is as the biggest republic, as perhaps the republic that had participated the most in the Yugoslav economy, in the development of the Yugoslav system, should get more out of the country once it was leaving it, if it were to leave it. The alternate description of his policies would be he wanted to keep Yugoslavia together. Again, this is a completely different topic that we don't need to talk about today, but basically these ethnic groups and nationalist groups were clashing, and the Yugoslav army was being used to intervene and become, and first of all, sort of calm things down, but then ended up becoming a warring side or party in this conflict. So this is happening while Europe and NATO are thinking about what their future role is. And so with the formation of the European Union, NATO becomes, and this was something that the US side was very involved in, but the European Union wants to form its own sort of military structures, at least mechanisms, ways of becoming, for future military actions and or financing, establishing its armies. This was a big part of the integration of the new countries that had, we have a wider European map. Anyway, new countries that had left that had former socialist countries that were going to be part of the Union. And we don't know exactly to what extent these countries were interested initially in the conflict, mainly because it started escalating, becoming involved in the conflict, it started escalating very quickly. We have the first casualties in 1991, massive casualties in 1991 in Croatia. The war in Croatia, it spills over to Bosnia very quickly, and Bosnia thinks to escalate even more. There are more civilian casualties in Bosnia. At the same time, in Kosovo on the other side, we have incidents breaking out, isolated, not as many civilian casualties because the war there hadn't escalated yet. And all this is happening while sort of the situation in the country is not going very well. And so now NATO has two options. It could either choose to not become involved, or it could choose to incorporate, not become involved, or it could choose to think of a common response with Russia now, because this is the vacuum that was created with the fall of the Warsaw Pact, where Russia was supposed to have a new role in the European security apparatus. What happens initially is that UN monitors and OSCE monitors later on, and EU monitors are sent in, and the crime keeps escalating. The incidents keep escalating. Towards the end of, in April of 1995, UN monitors get taken hostage by the Bosnian Serb army in Gorazde. And this is the first time where NATO has to actually consider sending in or launching airstrikes because it has to protect its own personnel that was taken hostage in Gorazde. This makes the situation really tricky because if this conflict escalates to airstrikes, what would stop them from sending more airstrikes should it get worse in eastern Bosnia? And the Russian side is involved in all of this. They're part of the contact groups. They're part of the debate around this. They end up sending in peacekeepers in Bosnia, not militarily involved, but peacekeepers. Then in July 1995, news breaks of the large-scale massacre in Srebrenica on July 11th of 1995, where around 8,000 civilians were killed within one day. And this is sort of the massive wake-up call to the West, where it's like, we have to actually step in. We can't have our little liberal freedom end of history party in Europe while while this is going on in the Balkans. And the Security General at this point, NATO Security General, decides to speed up things. He doesn't go through the Security Council, which would actually be needed to give NATO approval for airstrikes in Bosnia. He sends it to he goes to the UN Military General and gives them approval to request airstrikes from NATO. And NATO launches a 2-week airstrike, 2 weeks of airstrikes in Bosnia, which effectively end the war. Then NATO and Russia become part, and all these other countries become part of the Dayton Peace Accords, which end up setting up the post-war Bosnia. Peace is restored in Europe to some extent. However, the situation in Kosovo has still not been solved because Kosovo, as the southern province of Serbia, has a large Albanian majority. The Albanians don't want to be part of Serbia anymore. On the other hand, Serbia doesn't want to grant independence or any sort of autonomy to its southern province, which is also, ironically, the place where it's the place where a lot of its first medieval kingdom was set up, the heart of the Serbian nation. It's something that they don't want to relinquish easily. But all these groups that were involved in Bosnia now transfer to Kosovo, and they are involved in intense negotiations with Slobodan Milosevic to sort of use diplomatic means to prevent any form of Western intervention. And again, this doesn't produce very many results because Milosevic is facing a big crisis back home. There are protests going on in Serbia on a monthly basis. Inflation is high because of the many embargoes that have been imposed on Yugoslavia at this point. He has created this network of criminal organizations that are propping him up and making sure he stays in power, and they also want him to stay in power. And also everyone, because on one hand, also Russia's strong resistance to airstrikes. Airstrikes were put on the table very early on, but on one hand, because of the Russian reluctance, nobody expected them to actually escalate, for it to actually escalate to this point. And then, to the very point that in early 1999, as the last sort of attempts were being made by the US side, by everyone else to solve this, airstrikes were so negatively perceived in Europe that even, let's say, a country like the Czech Republic that is perceived as that builds a lot of its modern identity on a failed revolution, revolution that was made to liberalize Czech socialist society, where it bemoans the lack of Western intervention in this revolution to sort of help keep that government in power. Even the Czech public is like, no. The German public, the German political elite, keeps going on TV all the time to talk about these airstrikes. We have to intervene. It's a massive humanitarian crisis. We have to get involved. And it's still, Germany, especially since this will be the first conflict that Germany, or any military action that Germany, as a unified Germany, was involved in since World War II. At some point, the diplomatic efforts did not imploded, and NATO decides to get to launch airstrikes on Yugoslavia. The interesting thing being that the Russian party, which was involved in the debate the whole time, does not get notified until 3 hours before the bombing starts, where the Prime Minister Primakov at the time is on a flight to Washington D.C. and has it turn around once he realized that the bombings on Yugoslavia have been launched. Again, the airstrike was supposed to be short-lived. It was supposed to be limited to military targets and other resources that were associated with the military. But Milosevic didn't want to give up. And what happened was that the worst atrocities in the Kosovo conflict actually happened during the bombing, because utter chaos erupts. You have the Yugoslav army that is now making use of this free-for-all to become to do what it wants to do in Kosovo. The Kosovo side, which is usually, so in Kosovo there was a separation between the main political party at the time, which had a non-violent approach, and these self-organized guerrillas called the Kosovo Liberation Army, who were sort of armed and wanted to sort of take up an armed revolt against the Yugoslav army. These were escalating. The number of casualties were going up, and Milosevic didn't want to give up. 11 weeks. There's never been a bombing like this. In 11 weeks, NATO keeps looking for new targets, new places to bomb. Obviously, because of the difficulty of carrying out airstrikes of that without any, they didn't have any ground support. They did rely on the Kosovo Liberation Army, as they did and as they do in any other conflicts that NATO was involved in. They relied on the Kosovo Liberation Army to be sort of the local eyes and ears for the stuff they were doing. But of course, the intelligence was flawed, and they end up hitting refugee convoys, buses, and stuff like that. Only in June of 1995. When, and he had been assigned earlier, but the Yeltsin assigns a special envoy to the for this war, Chernomyrdin, if I'm not mistaken, and he ends up convincing Milosevic to sit down and sign an agreement. This agreement is signed in Kumanovo in June of 1995, and it signifies the end of the war in Yugoslavia completely, because Milosevic, and Milosevic sort of its last stand, because very quickly he's toppled from power through elections that occur soon after that in Serbia. Anyway, Yugoslav troops pull out, Yugoslav political elite pulls out, and Kosovo becomes the first European protectorate that is completely monitored and overseen by NATO. NATO oversees its airspace, it oversees its borders. And this sort of pet project of the West has to this day remained a thorn in the side of the Russian foreign policy and security efforts in Europe, because it was seen as too much an overkill, sort of too much of an overreaction to a situation that might have at some point have been solved through diplomatic efforts. Anyway, fast forward. This is 1999. Fast forward 9 years later, in 2008. Until 2008, Kosovo was overseen by the United Nations mission in Kosovo, again, which is the top political level of the country. It does organize its own elections, does have a parliament, but it doesn't, it functions effectively as a UN and NATO protectorate. In 2008, there are debates going on about Kosovo finally declaring independence and solving the political status of Europe, because since then, so since 1999, between 1999 and 2008, all these countries end up joining NATO, so the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltic states. NATO has expanded. The EU has expanded, joining most of these countries that have joined NATO also joined the EU, which is why this process is these two parallel processes are often referred to as Euro-Atlantic integration. And they become NATO, the NATO forces in the country, the UN forces in the country, have to come to a decision as to the future of Kosovo. 2008 is also the time when escalations were happening in Georgia. And it's there's this pattern since 1999. At any given point when there's a big hurdle, a big achievement that has to be made in the solidifying independence of Kosovo, the Russian side has used for either escalations on its end or a complete sort of a disbanding of diplomatic communications or a degradation in sort of communications between DC and Moscow. Kosovo does declare independence, and this is seen as sort of the final straw of any sort of efforts to reestablish international security, an international security system where Russia and the United States will be on the same side. Because in the Bush years, the early Obama years, so Obama followed after that, there was an attempt to sort of reset the clock and be like, okay, we can go back and talk about these things. And while on the other hand, NATO was strongly involved in expanding its presence in the Balkans. And to this point, we have obviously Croatia, Slovenia, who joined NATO, Montenegro recently joined NATO, and Albania, Macedonia, and Bulgaria and Romania before, and Greece and Turkey. Greece and Turkey, one of the first states to join in 1955, after the initial Western European expansion. And so Macedonia is set to join, and so now, slide. So these are the countries that are not part of it. Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo and Serbia, obviously, both have, so Bosnia and Herzegovina is separated has a political system currently, not to go into detail about that, but that is basically separated along ethnic lines. You have a Serb, a Croat, and a Bosniak representative, and the Serbian presidential representative has often been strongly under the influence of Belgrade. And Macedonia is probably set to join NATO very soon because Macedonia held a recent referendum regarding its name in October of this year, where it went from being called the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia to being through a referendum changing its name to North Macedonia. Why this is an issue is because Greece, which is found in its southern border, has a northern province in itself, northern province that is also referred to as Macedonia historically. Alexander the Great is thought to be is the son of Philip of Macedon, so he's also of Macedonian descent, claimed both by Macedonia and Greece. Nationalism and history, again, nothing surprising. So Macedonia is set to join NATO very soon. And we have all this big block of sort of countries that surround Serbia who definitely doesn't want to be part of NATO at this point, even though the current president, Aleksandar Vučić, has definitely has hinted towards, he's definitely supported European integration, which has often gone hand in hand with NATO integration. But the NATO bombing is such a big scar in Serbian society, and it ends up dividing the Kosovar and the Serbian political elite, or making it difficult for them to communicate to this day. They're now found in a dialogue that is facilitated by Brussels and the European Union, which is set to normalize relations, which is not being completed and will probably stretch on to the next couple of years. And on the other hand, and so the population in Serbia remembers the bombing and everything that occurred around it in a way that will make it very difficult for them to integrate into NATO very soon. So that's when it comes to the Balkans. The big question now, so the Kosovo bombing, or the Yugoslavia bombing for Kosovo, if you want to refer to it as that, is seen as having set a precedent that will reverberate around or influence future decisions of NATO to intervene in other parts of the world. The point where it is thought to, expected to, where the issue of NATO intervention is debated is, of course, the Ukraine crisis, where we see, and to be very, very brief, because I assume there are people in this room who know this 10 times better than me. So in 2013, the Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, decides to sort of reverse or not go through with an association plan with the European Union. This causes mass revolt in Ukraine because it is, on one hand, seen to be a decision influenced by Russia, which doesn't want the EU to get so close to its border. On the other hand, influenced by other groups within Ukraine who want to see it more on a more pro-Eastern path rather than a Western one. These protests spread across the country. Unrest erupts on the eastern Ukrainian border region of Donbass and to some extent Crimea. Russia ends up supporting politically the Eastern Ukrainian separatists who form their own independent states. It supports the referendum in Crimea, ends up absorbing Crimea into Russia, a decision that is not accepted by the West. And so we have this new big crisis on Europe's eastern border that, if we were to follow the logic of the 90s, would definitely require NATO intervention. But NATO's been very reluctant to become involved because it's considered to be too close and too provocative to Russia. But on the other hand, you have a Ukraine which sees this as, the European Union and NATO have invested endless amounts of money in setting up Kosovo as the perfect pet project. It is, most of the economy is run, very, very, very small, and Kosovo sees a lot of foreign aid in both economic affairs, infrastructure, and developmental affairs, and all that. And so Kosovo gets all of this, whereas Ukraine gets a lot less and nothing at a moment where it finds itself in crisis. And how this affects a very specific sort of mindset on what is commonly referred to as the European periphery, is that the Western community of nations only wants to intervene and get involved in our conflicts when there's a direct interest in that. In the Kosovo scenario, NATO needed a foothold in Southeast Europe. It needed to sort of show that it was it could become involved in solving big conflicts. And this is in the 90s when a lot of the other conflicts that NATO had been involved in had subsided. Whereas Ukraine, which is a latent and active issue that they could become involved in, does not apparently require intervention. This, combined with the lack of an clear EU perspective, is something that has affected voters and citizens in the way that, in a similar way that it did in the Balkans in the 90s, and it still does. Nationalist groups that see this as being, in the Balkan case, Serbian nationalist groups see the Balkans as the Western playground where they get to do whatever they want, intervene wherever they want, intervene in internal affairs because in the Kosovo scenario, they were part of the Kosovo was part of officially the southern province of Serbia, so it was part of the country, so now we have a situation where. The biggest irony of this being that Kosovo is neither a NATO member and not even close to becoming an EU member, because it has functioned as a protectorate for so long. It needed the West to be part of every segment of its existence to the point where it didn't manage to establish democratic institutions. It didn't establish elections are relatively fair. You have the dominance of the political party that came out of the KLA, the guerrilla movement I mentioned that was fighting the Yugoslav forces in the 90s. And it has not been able to, get on its own feet and form an effective and functioning country. So the failures of Kosovo often reflect, and the successes, often reflect the way NATO chooses to act and expand in Eastern Europe. And I'll get into this within the discussion with Elizabeth. What should be mentioned about the NATO bombing as well is that, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the bombing, and in no way have the problems that were present in the 90s been solved in the Balkans. It is still an example of extreme nationalism, ethnic divisions, escalations, not war, not military, because NATO peacekeepers are present in Kosovo and to some extent in Bosnia, but this region has definitely not recovered from its breakup. And people who were against the NATO bombing would say that this should have been handled, yes, supported diplomatically, but handled by the people on the ground. Others say that it should have been, who support the NATO bombing insist that these arguments shouldn't be had because the moral debate about preventing casualties and actually saving lives is the one that trumps everything else. So that's all for me, and I look forward to your questions. This was more of a background, and I really hope that in the discussion we can hash out sort of the intricacies of this issue. Thank you.
So following the Starr Forum format that many of you have enjoyed over the time, what we'll do now is we'll have about 10, 15 minutes of discussion in front of you. I have some questions for Una that I think will be interesting, and then we'll open it up for everybody else's questions. There's one right here. So Una, it sounds like what you're saying is that if we compare the Kosovo situation and the Ukraine situation, NATO has acted really quite in different ways. That in Kosovo, the situation has been NATO, a complete takeover, extensive bombing. I looked up the numbers, and there were 38,000 sorties in that 4-month period. There were 700 US planes. There were, just huge numbers of violence and so on. Ukraine, the opposite. Lugansk, Donetsk are sitting there, huge debates in Congress, whether even to give the Javelin fighters. Why do you think that the two situations are so different? What is it about Kosovo? It's partly, you've said it's geography. Perhaps the geography of being closer to Russia, being closer to Europe. Say more. What makes these two situations so different?
So the main difference is the setting, and that's why I spent so much time setting it up. The setting in the 90s and the setting right now. So in the 90s, NATO and the EU and the OSCE, which was then being set up, all of them wanted to incorporate Russia and all of its former socialist countries of Eastern Europe into its security structures. And Yugoslavia was seen as just a hitch. We needed to intervene to get rid of this little problem, and then we would incorporate everyone in the same structures, and then we won't have to worry about the way we'll intervene in future conflicts because we're all going to be part of a wider security structure. This doesn't necessarily mean that they actually, even though this is often discussed, planned for Russia itself to be part of the EU definitely not, but NATO as well. But it was seen as like the small problem that can be solved easily. At this point, because in a process that was started by the bombing in Kosovo, the relationship between Russia and the EU and NATO when it comes to security issues has gotten, like the divide has grown so big that now we're talking about opposed sides, which wasn't the case. The NATO bombing resets the East-West divide that was sort of overcome with the end of the Cold War. In many ways, not to the same extent, of course, not the size, but we're talking about a world order where a different world order where it's not as bipolar, where it's not as divisive, and where there's more concentration from the U.S. and Russia on issues of security. And the fact that Russia's opinion in regarding the intervention in Serbia was not taken seriously or not incorporated a lot. As much, so Russia was part of the contact group, was part of the negotiations, the diplomatic efforts, and all that. But the airstrikes were always sort of something that was a no-go. And so that's very different with Ukraine, because now we're talking about a NATO that does not want to, is most likely not going to expand into Ukraine anytime soon, and know that this would be an escalation on the borders.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from the Russian perspective, you're absolutely right that in '97 there was discussion of the NATO-Russian charter, that they would be working together, that there would be harmony. '99 from the U.S. issue, as the U.S. press covered it, was the human rights violations, what the Kosovo Albanians could be doing to the Serbians, what the Serbians could be doing to the Albanians, and so on. And whereas in Russia, this led to a whole set of resentments and frustrations. And at one point, Alexander Lebed, who was trying to position himself as a potential presidential candidate in Russia, referred to Russia as a humiliated and offended nation. August of '99, Putin is brought in. And I remember myself thinking during that period of the bombings that while everyone here was busy talking about the human rights issues, they were ignoring the bludgeoning, I would call it Neanderthal use of force that was so extensive. And I predicted, and it seems, alas, that I was right, that it would give rise to strongman politics in the region as local nations decided we have to have a strongman politics because the US and NATO are going to use this. And I'm wondering whether you think that's true. Do you think there's been a kind of strongman politics that comes out of this? Putin positions himself from the beginning as a war president. He has to solve Chechnya first, but then he can position himself as he's not going to be kicked around by the West. Vučić does the same. Dodik, we should explain who they are, but do you feel that in the Balkan context that the local leaders are also trying to play a strongman politics, both vis-a-vis each other and potentially vis-a-vis Europe?
So with Kosovo, there's a big client state that's basically created. I mean, the Kosovo government does not only consult with the West, literally their press releases are handed over to them directly from Western embassy. And this is fine because those people who were elected in power after 1999 were not very efficient leaders. So that, from all these scenarios, might not be the worst one. So it's separated. It's strongly separated, and Serbia is also humiliated. And this has made it really hard for this Serbian society to recover. You still have the current Serbian prime minister denies openly, did that on Deutsche Welle months ago, denies that there was a genocide in Srebrenica because the way Serbia dealt with the bombing, it's different when you have combatants on the field and you have one army and then you have another army and it's equal. And they felt there was this big Western power that just came in and for reasons, and I talked about some of them, reasons that might have been legitimate, but there's this big Western power that comes in and just rains down bombs on us, and especially amongst the population, because Serbia, again, unlike other parts of the Balkans, had been spared from war directly. People in Belgrade hadn't seen any war, Novi Sad hadn't seen any war. These are different parts of Serbia. South, north hadn't seen any war, and then all of a sudden there's these bombs that come in. Of course, just like the Russian situation with Chechnya and all that, the Serbian public was handed sort of strong, only had access to intense Serbian TV propaganda, which made their awareness about what was going on in the rest of the Balkans very, very low. And so this made it so hard has made it so hard for the Serbian politics, even the reformist Prime Minister Zoran Đinđić, who was killed after getting power. He was probably the most progressive force the country has seen since 1999 or since Milosevic. It made it, even for him and then Boris Tadic as well later, all of them have had a hard time dealing, A, with the Kosovo issue, talking about Kosovo openly, and B, sort of getting the country out of this like wartime fatigue that was created in the 90s because of its implications in the Yugoslav wars, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. So as a Russia watcher, I see a lot of connection between both Vučić in Serbia and also Dodik in Banja Luka and Republika Srpska. So just quick background, and thank you for all this background. Bosnia itself is divided into two parts. One is Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the other part is Republika Srpska, which is still Serbian dominated. Putin has been involved, has been to Belgrade he's coming as will be like the fourth times, and he's come on the liberation of the Red Army Day at the end of World War II from October 44.
To set up a statue of Nikolai II.
Exactly. He came, he said, I guess he sent Lavrov for the Nikolai II. He had Tsereteli, this famous Georgian sculptor who made the Peter the Great in Moscow, which is an absurd statue, make a Nicholas II Tsar, the last Russian Romanov Tsar in Banja Luka. What do you make of all these connections? Are they just fraternal relations of two Orthodox powers? Is there more going on? What do you think?
It's very interesting because what the bombing also did, so Serbian society, of course, with the fall of socialism, countries, you have this initial sort of re-traditionalization of these societies in the sense that they become more religious, they become more nativist about, they're more focused on their ethnic and national identity. This happens to the Croats, the Bosniaks, so the Catholic ethnic group, the Muslim ethnic group, the Syrian Orthodox ethnic group. And so in that sense, yeah, there's a re-establishment of relations with Russia. I say re-establishment because even while there were sentimental ties between Yugoslavia and the Yugoslav Serbs and the Russians before, Yugoslavia maintained a policy of not, even as a socialist country, it didn't favoritize the Russian Federation or the Soviet Union, and even was very open to mocking and criticizing its form of socialism. And we met with one of the later Russian ambassadors, U.S. ambassadors to Russia, and he remembers during a trip in the 90s in Belgrade where he jokingly referred to one of his friends, "Oh, you're acting like a Russian," and he got offended because it was like, not that that's a good thing to be offended for, but I'm just saying in terms of context, that's what the situation was in the 90s, which isn't the case now. You have Putin coming to Belgrade tomorrow, and the Serbian press has been going out of its way to sort of show how happy they are that they have him there, and how they want people to come in and to organize sort of grand sort of parade and around his visit and all that. So.
I know you've actually been writing about the protests in Belgrade right
Yes.
now, and I'd be curious, what do you think is going to happen when Putin comes tomorrow? Are there, there's going to be these pro-Putin demonstrations. Mm-hmm. What about the protesters on the ground? Maybe say a few words about that.
There have been opposition protests going on in Serbia for a couple of weeks. They began in early December after an opposition politician was beaten up in a southern Serbian city before a debate, and so they launched these protests, but very quickly they expanded, and people from all different kinds of backgrounds and definitely no party affiliation or they necessarily have a party affiliation when they joined the protests, started protesting in Belgrade every week, and the protests kept getting bigger. Vučić downplayed them mainly because the opposition in Serbia is so fragile and unorganized and disorganized and unable to sort of represent a credible threat to his power. But people who've been involved in the protests have announced that they're going to be gathering in Belgrade tomorrow. However, knowing Vučić, I believe that there are security measures set in place to not let them interfere with the parade, because there were protests announced in 2014 when Putin visited the last time.
I think I'll ask one more question, then we'll open it up. I'm very curious. Kosovo has announced that they're going to create an army. And it seems to me that there's much symbolic meaning for Kosovo as not quite its own nation, developing its own army. But so I'm curious if you could spell out first, what are the symbolic issues? Why upgrade their security force to an army? And also, what might be the repercussions if other powers in the area say, whoa, we're not comfortable with Kosovo having an army?
So after the bombing, NATO was the peacekeeping force there. And having the world's best trained military be your peacekeeping force made it completely unnecessary for there to be an army, as well as the fact that the agreement that led to the capitulation of the Yugoslav army in Kosovo, or the removal from Kosovo, clearly listed the demilitarization of the Kosovo Liberation Army as one of its conditions. And so for a long time it had this security force that was, would intervene and I don't mean to offend anyone, but in humanitarian sort of events. It didn't do very much, but that was fine. For the symbolics of having someone parade around on Independence Day, they had an army or a security force. It was not allowed to be called an army, and that's set up in the Kosovo's constitution in order to not sort of inflame relations with Serbia, because Kosovo still exists internationally through Resolution 1244, which was the UN resolution that was passed in 1999 after the end of the bombing, which again was strongly saw a strong Russian hand in its setting up, because why it's since then made it so difficult for this Kosovo situation to be solved is because Russia made sure that the political status of Kosovo would go through the Security Council. And it knew that once it went to the Security Council, it could exercise its veto. And China has not been favorable towards the Kosovo independence issue either. So in UN Resolution 1244, it says, the longer form of the resolution says that, should the political status change, it would be subject to Security Council approval. And Kosovo is not set up as an independent country fully. The president, because he's facing, Hashim Thaçi, he's been in power, he was prime minister first, and became president, as they do, and he's been getting a lot of blowback, or a lot of resentment from the population, because he hasn't managed to deliver. His government has not delivered on EU integration, on any form of sort of integration of Kosovo into the regional sort of situation in the Balkans. It isn't part of Interpol. It isn't part of any sort of international body that would make it easier for its citizens to travel around the world or be part of the global society. And as such, he chooses a nationalist measure, so a very entirely insignificant one, even if the Kosovo army were to be set up tomorrow morning, it would never be more efficient than the NATO peacekeepers were there. But it's a move to sort of quell the dissident voices in the country, and yeah, so that's what happened. And of course, it's seen as a major provocation by Serbia and a direct sort of violation of UNSC Resolution 1244.
I can't resist one more question. What about Montenegro? So Montenegro is now part of NATO. Is that?
You should ask Manafort.
Yes. Tell us, what do you think about the American connection on that one, but also how is that viewed in the rest of the Balkans? I mean, you're creating this patchwork of NATO, not NATO. How do people view that?
So Montenegro was tricky because it was, so when all these other Yugoslav republics left, the only loyal republic that remained loyal to Serbia was Montenegro. They share the same faith, more or less, a lot of the similar history. But because Montenegro chooses because of the political constellations of the time, and because, like all these other Balkan republics, it felt it had somewhat more of a distinct ethnic and national identity. This is where the term Balkanization comes from. These countries like separating into smaller units so that every little village can be independent. So Montenegro, through a referendum, declares independence, or after a referendum, declares independence in 2006, and it is staunchly pro-European very early on. They decide to be to get on their NATO path at some point, because Montenegro is seen to be a country that could be susceptible to Russian influence. Now, this is seen for different ways. There are a lot of, when Montenegro has a very active sort of tourist industry. It's a coastal country, so that's pretty and nice. But also, a lot of its industries right after the fall of Yugoslavia were bought up by Russian oligarchs. And it has a big Russian immigrant community, one of the biggest in the region, ranging from oligarchs to political emigres, so who live and work there. So it was always seen as a country that was very susceptible to Russian influences, and either directly or through Serbia. And so, which is why NATO pushed so hard for its inclusion into NATO, unlike with other states in the region. Right now, it is seen as a relatively stable example compared to Macedonia, who has yet to to become a NATO member. Macedonia was one of the countries in the region that did so well in its reform processes that it was thought to be able to join Croatia, to join the European Union together with Croatia in 2013, but ended up not doing this because it got an authoritarian leader who, for different reasons, decided to play up its national history, built a lot of monuments all over Macedonia, with Alexander the Great and Philip of Macedon, which got Greece really angry. And so they backtracked a lot on the progress that was made initially. And now with the name referendum, and Putin actually did, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia did put up a statement the other day condemning the fact that Macedonia was forced, because this is right, the Macedonian parliament approved the resolution that would change its name. We should now refer to it as North Macedonia. I'm trying to get the hang of it. But North Macedonia, becoming an official thing a couple of days ago, probed the Russian Foreign Ministry and sending out commenting on it in a way that NATO forced Macedonia to change its name so that it can be part of it, which technically is true. One of the reasons that Macedonia could not join NATO was because Greece opposed its joining NATO with the name Macedonia. So it was constantly referred to as the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and had difficulties in joining many other organizations because of that.
Wow. So we see quite a patchwork here. I think we're going to open it up for questions. I have many more questions if we somehow, but let me see. I'll take the first hand I see. Be sure to ask, come down to the mic, and be sure to ask questions. You may have a small comment, but let's keep the dialogue going.
Is Russia still holding 3 Ukrainian Navy vessels? And if so, what's going to be the outcome of that?
That's a question for Elizabeth, actually.
Yes, they are, and I'm not sure what's going to happen.
I recall during the bombings, the Chinese embassy was hit. And NATO and the American forces said it was an accident, and China said it was intentional. And I knew several American-Chinese people who sided with China and thought it was intentional. Do you have any thoughts on, obviously the intention, it seems like the message was tried to say to China, don't be involved with this. Were they secretly behind the scenes creating chaos to escalate the problem? So your thoughts on that?
China was very supportive of Milosevic throughout the 90s, as was Russia. But actually, even China was even more vocal in its support than Russia, because Russia was trying to democratize, was getting all this Western aid, and didn't want to send out this image of being, because. And I mentioned this, I think, briefly, but Milosevic, he played between wanting to, with the ideas of like forming a big Serbian state and keeping communism alive. And that's the thread that China got. China got involved in the keeping communism alive sort of rhetoric. And so they were very big on wanting to see Milosevic stay in power. Official accounts to this day are that it was an accident, but yeah.
Why don't we take one from this side?
I have a question after all.
Yeah.
So I worked at the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, and I'm curious, many of my colleagues went on to the new tribunal having to do with Kosovo questions,
Excellent
and I was
question.
wondering, because that's coming from an international body, in fact, I'm not quite sure whether it's who is behind it, but I think it's European Union, if you could untangle a little bit of the relationships between the pending Kosovo trials and the attitude towards them in the Kosovo political ranks, and also in the Mitrovica community, and also the NATO relationships to those things. In a sentence, just a
It's great. That's an excellent question. Do I answer that? Or do you?
No, take it. Good question.
So that's a great question because, and I didn't mention it in my presentation, but one of the reasons why it was a lot easier, why the 99 bombing, by the time things had come around to the 99 bombing, Milosevic had such a bad reputation in the West, was because in the meantime the ICTY was set up, and a lot of the involvement of the Yugoslav army, with or without direct involvement and or bolstering from Milosevic in Bosnia, was starting to surface. So
Explain ICTY.
The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was sort of a landmark tribunal, much like the one in Rwanda. The namesake of the fellowship that I'm here with Elizabeth Neuffer, covered the ICTY and the Rwanda tribunals extensively. It was seen as this big, it was an international court, organized for the first time since the Nuremberg trials, where war crimes were going to be put on trial by an unbiased international body of legal experts, and prosecutors and judges and so on and so forth. Ellen, having worked there, might have a better explanation for it, but that's basically it. And so the ICTY did cover the Kosovo War, but a lot less. This was sort of the end of its mandate. Its mandate ends. And a lot of people are going to write back to me if I'm not right about this, but with the end of the bombing. So end of the bombing is end of the mandate, and stuff that happened afterwards, a lot of the attacks by Albanians on the Serbs who were leaving Kosovo after the bombing, all that kind of stuff at the time was not included. And so why Ellen mentions a court that is being set up now, which will focus exclusively on the Kosovo Liberation Army. Why it relates to our debate about NATO is because NATO, so the US was very strongly opposed to the court. And it decided to play a big role in setting up the court just so it could help define its parameters. Why this was important is because the Kosovo Liberation Army were the eyes and the ears of NATO on the ground. They were not accepted as a legitimate military force or a legitimate army in the conflict until the NATO got involved and sort of gave them the legitimacy that they had lacked so far. And the Kosovo Liberation Army had people who defended their communities from the assault of the Yugoslav army and so on and so forth, but also committed war crimes for which they were not persecuted. And it's prosecuted. And it's different when the war crimes are committed by the army of one of the Balkan countries, and it's different when they're committed by an army that is such strong U.S. support. And so the court was set up after a report by a Swiss prosecutor, which found out that there had been organ trafficking, this is a province, so we have to be careful, conducted by some of the members of the KLA, kidnappings and torture and ethnic cleansing and so on and so forth. And the court will deal specifically with these things once it's set up in order to sort of deal with the unresolved issues from the war in 1999 that haven't been dealt with, mainly because, and I mean this is again, we have to be careful with these classifications, but a lot of the people who were in the KLA ended up being in power afterwards in governments that were supported strongly by the EU, by NATO, and by the US. So these people were in government, including the current president, and they might be indicted by the court. And that's the background and why it ties into NATO.
Uh-huh. That answers your question? Yes. Great, fascinating. Let's take one more.
Good afternoon. My name is Seth Johnson. I'm from the Center for European Studies at Harvard. Thanks for your remarks today. I want to ask you a question about the tension that is sometimes drawn in NATO between security interests on the one hand and democratic values on the other hand. And allow me to put the question this way in terms of what the NATO treaty text actually says. The most frequently cited passage from the NATO treaty is the Mutual Defense Clause, the so-called Article 5 that everyone's familiar with. Less frequently cited is the specific articulation in the treaty that NATO stands for democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. And even in the passage of the treaty that talks about the openness of the alliance to bringing in new members, there's a phrase in there about new members have to be able to further the principles of the alliance, these democratic values.
So why aren't they involved in Ukraine?
Sorry?
So why aren't they involved in Ukraine?
Yeah. So, I mean, I suppose my question to you is, what do you think is the record of NATO in this regard, in Ukraine, but also specifically to those countries that have joined the alliance in the Balkans? Do you see NATO's impact on domestic politics having been constructive to its stated aims?
So Article 5 is cited a lot, but NATO's big, again, which plays into our big debate about Eastern European security and all issues and stuff like that, is the fact that the first big intervention that NATO had was in a non-member country and in a foreign conflict. And so you think about, and this is, how can this not make non-NATO members sort of scared about the prospect of them being involved? They know they can't attack Poland now, or they know they can't attack Germany without having, everyone else become involved. But these were countries that were not part of it. Again, so that ties in with you, I guess, the fact, the official stance of NATO when it chose to launch airstrikes on Yugoslavia without getting Security Council approval was, we are becoming involved in a humanitarian issue. And, I mean, this is such a difficult debate to have because it's not easy for anyone to say they shouldn't have gotten involved because obviously more people would have died.
Well, let me try to tackle it. I've thought about this question for a long time, and I obviously don't have an answer. But it seems to me an interesting question to ask whether more people. So the conversation. Let me relate a conversation I had with Bill Hill, who was here in the fall as a speaker. William Hill is a former diplomat who has had postings in Moscow, in Transnistria,
Yugoslavia.
in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and he was very, very involved in the OSCE, the Office of Security and Cooperation in Europe. And what he said, and he says it in his book, No Place for Russia, that OSCE had its largest concentration of monitors that they had ever put anywhere in Kosovo in June of 1999, or not June, in March of 1999,
Yes.
before the bombing started. And he and I have had interesting conversations about what is the role of monitors on the ground versus military responses to human rights abuses. And I think it's still an open question whether, in fact, if you just couldn't, at least we could put a thought experiment, right? We're in a major university. We can use our minds to think about this. What if the monitors had been allowed to increase their footprint so that any atrocities that happened could have been caught at the moment? What he says, one of the reasons NATO was called in was that the American who was in charge of that region, who was working somewhat with OSCE, but also somewhat with the U.S. command, was a guy, and I'm sorry I've forgotten his name.
Richard Holbrooke.
Yeah.
Holbrooke?
No, was it Holbrooke who had been in El Salvador in 1980 when, for those of us who are older, we remember this. 1980 had seen horrific violence against 4 Maryknoll sisters and some church members, Maryknoll sisters being Americans. And the U.S. did not respond. And this guy I don't think it was Holbrooke.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Although Holbrooke was, of course, there, and Holbrooke was a major player. This was a minor player. But he said, wait, we didn't respond when atrocities were committed. We have to respond now. And of course, we also have to remember one thing you haven't mentioned is, you have mentioned, but that Rwanda had happened, Srebrenica had happened. Yeah. Everybody was totally paranoid about more human rights violations happening. So the climate was do something, do something, do something. But I still find myself wondering, what about the long-term effects? Something that our questioner asked, this was such a great question, but Seth didn't bring up is, what about the long-term effects of the munitions that fell, the mines that were planted, they were using cluster bombs, which were actually illegal. Mm-hmm. Where is our discussion about that? Mm-hmm. I think that's also an important piece of and also the long term, what I'm really worried about and why this topic is so important, and I'm so glad you agreed to speak on it, is the continued fragmentation of the Balkans. I was just in Sarajevo where in Bosnia, you have 3 different sets of education: the Bosniaks, the Croats, and in Herzegovina, and the Serbians. Literally have different education systems for their children. They talk about the massacres in the siege of Sarajevo, which was one of the world's longest sieges ever. It was 4 years. It was longer even than the siege of Leningrad, which is hard to believe. And people are still not even able to talk to each other about these things. Has NATO solved anything by creating the protectorate of Kosovo? I think it's an interesting question.
Wow. Well, I was gonna just circle back to an answer to that question, and I guess answers yours as well. The interesting thing, and this comes from covering sort of North Kosovo on the ground. So within Kosovo, the northern part is Serb majority, and which is found on the Serbian border, and that's where a lot of the incidents happen nowadays because of the clashes with the Albanian majority, with the Albanian majority population in all of Kosovo and the Serb majority region. And this was for me so surprising. And this, of course, isn't everyone, but a lot of them are so open to having NATO there because they see them as a neutral arbiter. They don't trust the EU, NATO and the EU, sorry. they like NATO, as it's referred to in its Kosovo version as KFOR, the Kosovo forces, and the EU who are there, and they don't trust other like political options, stuff like that, when there's an escalation, because they know NATO is going to come in, isolate whatever's going on, the people, the groups that are involved, and not do anything else. This strategy is a little difficult because so NATO is not allowed to directly be involved in conflicts in Kosovo. It's only peacekeeping. It's not allowed to shoot at civilians unless shot at directly, and so on and so forth. And in 2004, there was a massive escalation of unrest in Kosovo, whereby the Albanian, big part of the Albanian population went into Serbian communities, burned down churches, houses. A lot of people, the last sort of groups of pockets of like Serbian in certain parts of Kosovo, and last pockets of like Serbs who were still living there left the country and all that kind of stuff. And NATO was not able to stop any of this. You know, you'd think with the biggest military alliance there, this stuff wouldn't happen. But it was because it could only stand in front of them to some extent. And then when it escalated, because they were also fearful that if they shot at the local population, they would turn against them at some point. So very limited in terms of democratization. It is only, and this is actually part of the whole debate about this, because I don't really agree with people who talk about NATO as this big force that is involved in every pore of society. It has the CIA, FBI, and everyone else is involved in making sure that NATO expands to the last little corner of Europe. It is limited in its scope in many ways, but on the other hand, it's this very powerful military alliance. And so we should also just, place it where it should be and not not sort of make a boogeyman on NATO on one hand, and on the other hand, have open conversations about what it should do in Eastern Europe.
That's good. Yeah, good. Other questions?
About a month ago, NATO approved the membership action plan for Bosnia.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you see the Serbian nationalists in Bosnia, the strongest client actually of Russia in Bosnia, Mr. Dodik, declaring how do you call it, the Bosnian Serb entity like independent. They don't clearly want to join NATO. How do you see the future of that?
So this is one of the big problems because, again, it circles back to the democracy element. So the president in Montenegro who delivered the NATO membership, it made Montenegro part of NATO, is someone who's been in power for 25 years. Has not encouraged democracy in Montenegro, has not encouraged, his part of a wide group of, and this has been documented, I'm not making it up, but like supports certain criminal groups in the country who might not make profit for him, but at least he oversees the way the economic activity is done in the country. He oversees the foreign investment. He's involved in all of these parts of society. So he's not a very democratic president, even though he delivered all these big sort of accession agreements into Montenegro. On the other hand, the Montenegrin opposition, as mentioned by the gentleman, is extremely pro-Russian and extremely nationalist. And an average Montenegrin citizen is caught between the decision of having a very pro-nationalist, pro-Russian and nationalist opposition come to power. Not all of them are pro-Russian, but the biggest factors in the opposition, the ones who could actually win elections are. Or keeping this guy who's been in power for 25 years. And so it's very tricky. And on the other hand, you have in Bosnia, but in the Serbian entity of Bosnia that Elizabeth mentioned earlier, you have Dodik, he's the president of one of the three presidents of Bosnia. Bosnia has three presidents, one president for each ethnic group. Bosnia is a really complicated country in the Balkans. And so he has officially been elected as president, and he says, well, Bosnia is just my place of work. I really am a Serb, and I feel I belong to Serbia, and Serbia is my real country. And he insists on forging strong ties with Russia and making this a big part of his foreign policy. The ironic thing being that Russia hasn't delivered. It is involved in Bosnia, but it hasn't always delivered on Dodik's nationalist rhetoric. So when Lavrov was recently in Banja Luka, he said, I support the Bosnian constitution, and I support the existence of Bosnia as a state, which goes directly against what Dodik says. And in other ways. So it's more complex, and it's definitely too complex for a region that's so small and has such a high concentration of different ethnic groups, countries, and so on and so forth, which is why it doesn't get covered by the foreign press a lot, or as much as let's say Ukraine does. But in the context of these debates is definitely interesting.
But Bosnia does have a member action plan to join
Yes,
NATO.
it doesn't have an
Do
EU.
you have any sense of whether that's likely to happen?
It's tricky because the reason why it has 3 presidents is because the agreement that was set up, overseen by the United States in 1995, 1996, the Dayton Agreement, signed in Dayton, Ohio, was set up a country that was they wanted to make sure that ethnic violence would never happen again, so there is an ethnic quota for every single office, official institutional position, from like the village council to the presidency, which makes it extremely hard to run that country. And it stalled reform, it stalled progress, it stalled all these kinds of things that would make it a country that would be in a successful EU member state. So it's not happening.
Do you think Serbia would ever join a Russian alliance? Would it ever be asked? I haven't heard anything of it doing, but Russia has tried to set up its parallel with the Eurasian Economic Union as a kind of counterweight to the European Union.
See, this is what's really important about the whole debate, because we often there's Russian influence in Serbia, but it isn't as big as it isn't as intense to lead to that sort of thing, because Serbia knows that it has so many more benefits from joining the EU. Just like Ukraine knows it has so many benefits from joining the EU. A much more stable community of nations, economically, internationally accepted, and so on and so forth, than going back to anything that would be led by Russia, unfortunately, I guess. But the problem, but it knows that it has this wild card, which is like anytime it feels like the EU is clamping down too hard or being too difficult with the ongoing accession process with Serbia, it can go and it can mention its ties with Russia. It can have Putin fly in for a day. They can go to visit him and do other things that would encourage this.
So are they actually trying to join the EU?
Yes, Serbia is actively trying to join the EU, but Serbia has a province in the south that it doesn't recognize.
Called Kosovo.
Kosovo. So, because one of the, of course, I mean, the basic tenets of any state in the world, but a basic parameter of any country, one of the rules that you have to follow is to have clearly defined borders. Serbia obviously does not have clearly defined borders at this point, so it will be something that they have to deal with. It is part of their EU accession plan, as Chapter 3.
Well, and actually that's one of the arguments about why Russia intervened in Ukraine was to make it so that Ukraine couldn't join NATO or the EU because the borders wouldn't be clearly defined. Do you buy that argument?
I don't know about the argument, but it's for sure made it harder.
Yeah,
It definitely made it
it's
harder.
a fact of what
The
happened.
ironic thing is, though, that Kosovo, so visa liberalization is part of the early stages of EU accession, because a country, so when members of the EU and some of the EU's periphery can travel within the EU through the Schengen, because of the Schengen Agreement, which allows for open borders and easy travel. The EU is, of course, members get this, but also like countries in the region, most of them, actually all of them, have Schengen except for Kosovo. And Kosovo was supposed to join a couple of years ago. There were political agreements, things that stopped it. But it's very ironic because this is a country that has so much EU presence but can't travel to any country in Europe without, or almost any country in Europe without a visa. That's what I have to put up with. And then Ukraine joined recently, even though the reason why Kosovo couldn't join was because it didn't have its northern border defined, and with northern border with Montenegro and Serbia defined entirely. So
Makes you wonder.
then that's what makes it the EU. That's what makes it an easy target of the Russian propaganda machine, because it bends and changes its rules, and it's like, you think this Copenhagen criteria is so strict, it's such a big part of the accession rules, and then you change it. You have fast-track countries like Romania and Bulgaria that joined very quickly to make sure to secure the sphere of influence that was on the western, in the Eastern Balkans. You made it easy for all these other countries to join, and then you make it so hard for others. And this is something that people in Serbia buy.
Okay.
Sorry,
So we have another question. Yeah, great.
This sounds so messy and entangled that this might be a naive question. Is there any possibility of NATO looking at this situation, taking another look at the situation and saying, our involvement in Kosovo is costing too much, withdraw, and Serbia takes it over again?
Oh, there are many, many debates going on about NATO being too expensive, the mission there being too expensive. This is something, doesn't, since the NATO troops in Kosovo are organized into Mixed Battle Group East, I believe, or in a wider battalion, it's called Mixed Battle Group East, which means that there are different contributing nations that are part of it. The German parliament, for example, has had many, many debates about how costly it is to keep sending all these people there, having them there at all. Other countries as well. And there's been a reduction of peacekeepers in Kosovo over the years. Would that lead to Serbia? I think not. But it would definitely, I think that assuming that having just the NATO peacekeepers there until the final political problem with Kosovo, the political instability in Kosovo is solved would be great. But a lot of the other missions can, and they have scaled them down. The EU had a big rule of law mission there because it was supporting the local judiciary, so it had this biggest civilian mission in its history, which is called ULEX, the EU rule of law mission in Kosovo, and did not manage to put any of the big criminals in jail, but it did manage to put a lot of them. By criminals, I mean both war crimes and corruption and everything else. So to not get into more complex debates, I don't think that Serbia would be, at this point, has an interest in going back into Kosovo. This is just like, again, with Ukraine. I don't think Russia actually considers having to, obviously not the entirety of it because it's an independent country, but it is enough of an issue that it can be used in political debates and like spreading nationalist rhetoric on a daily basis, but I don't think there's a real possibility of Serbia coming in and but I hope I'm right.
The question is regarding Kazakhstan and Central Asia. So the longest border between two countries is like between Russia and Kazakhstan. And what do you think? So now it's very good relationship between Kazakhstan and Russia. But what do you think? What is the chance and possibilities that Russia would intervene in Kazakhstan?
If it does, guess what it's going to name as a precedent?
Sorry.
If it does intervene, guess what it's going to name as a precedent? So when Russia became involved, when after the Crimean referendum and the absorption of Crimea into Russia, is absorption the word? Is annexation? Because I don't want to offend anyone. And so they, the issue that constantly kept being mentioned as a precedent was Kosovo. So if they could have, if self-determination was a valid concept in international political, legal, in the setting up of a recognized country that sought international recognition, why couldn't Crimea do it? If Kosovo could do it, why couldn't Crimea do it? Again, with Donetsk and Luhansk, if Kosovo can do it, why can't Donetsk and Luhansk do it? And this is the case for all the other regions found on the Russian periphery, near Broad, or territory of the Russian Federation itself that might be seeking independence. They constantly refer back to the Kosovo example. That's why we had this whole talk. Kosovo in itself is completely insignificant as a country. 1.8 million people that don't affect the regional economy of the Balkans and or anything else. But it's an interesting political example. I do not think that NATO won't get involved. NATO has made it, and this is the Balkans is as close as it's going to go at this point. In terms of becoming involved. I mean, it's not going to become involved in the Balkans anymore. It did that in the 90s. But it's the closest it's going to get in terms of sending troops and all that kind of stuff. And Poland.
Yeah, certainly I think that's exactly right. That Russia has, on the one hand, at the time, was furious about Kosovo, but then uses the Kosovo as the precedent for saying, well, Crimea had a referendum and Kosovo had a referendum.
It didn't actually.
It didn't.
Kosovo did, but
It
Kosovo,
was a myth of the
yes,
referendum.
yes, Kosovo.
Exactly. Whether Russia will intervene in Kazakhstan may depend a lot on what happens with Nazarbayev when Nazarbayev steps down. My understanding, and then we probably have to stop because it's 1:30, is that Russia tends to intervene when there's already a civil conflict going on. So they intervened in Georgia when Georgia was not that strong. They intervened, but especially in Crimea. The minute Yanukovych leaves power in Kiev, then, we can take Crimea. They say we had to because Yanukovych was out of power, but I argue that they could. They had the opportunity because, and Syria too, they don't intervene until the war gets messy enough that they can, it's very weak. Northern Kazakhstan does have a very large Russian population. I think people in Kazakhstan are very worried about the situation. You probably can tell us more. I'm actually wearing a Kazakh scarf. So, what?
I think one of your sons is Kazakh.
Yeah, my child is Kazakh, yes. I have very strong ties to Kazakhstan. You have a good memory. But in any event, so we'll see if they decide to use the, oh, we have to protect our neighbors. In the 19th century, that was the argument they typically used with what we now call the Balkan region. So what a great discussion. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you for all your questions. We'll be around for a few more minutes.